Hey, thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Gnostic Studies, and we'd like to do a um, a class today, a seminar. Just gonna share this link in case people want to join from other avenues. Pardon me. So today we want to do our class on self-observation, something called recording, which is a way of creating a memory related to self-observation. And then we're going to start talking about the right and wrong working of the centers. This is the 5th class of our Intermediate Studies in Gnostic Psychology series. And the first 4 classes, we talked about influences and impressions. And now we want to jump into the meat of the issue, which is the primary method of self-study, which is called self-observation. Before we jump into today's material, let's review really quick what we talked about in the previous class. We talked about transforming impressions and how and what impressions are. We receive impressions through the 5 senses, and then they enter into us. We said that when we see a chair or a table or anything, what happens is that the impression of that chair or the image of it is what enters into us. Not the chair in itself, but the image of it. So what we receive from the outside world is impressions, images, sounds, tastes, smells, sensations. But the sensations are something that our body, our organism, our human machine is processing. It doesn't come from the outside in the traditional way of thinking of it. So what happens is, in the work on ourselves, that we receive many impressions that are not useful for the work. That is, they're not useful for us getting closer to divinity, for us ending our suffering, those type of things. They are problematic and most likely the result of people with egos, just like us. So if we're able to transform those impressions, that is, digest those impressions, then we can free up the associations that are connected with them. So let's say someone insults me. If I can transform that impression and say, well, they're probably having a bad day, or they're upset, or even that is something that I need to work on, even though they said it in a mean way or an attacking way, and I can take the negative emotions out of it. If I'm able to transform that impression, then we change the mechanics, the mathematics, we could even say, inside of ourselves that's going on. Because then we don't give those impressions to the anger egos that we have, to the pride egos, to the vengeance, to all these things, because we end up recording those impressions as memories and associating them with some kind of emotion, often negative emotions. So someone insults me. Normally the way that I remember it is, oh, I don't like that person because they insulted me. and they insulted me from something and I don't know why and blah, blah, blah. So if I can transform that impression of them insulting me into, whatever it may be, particular to the situation, then I don't have to remember them in that way. I don't have to remember the other things that I associated with that memory either in that way. I don't have to remember that time when I was at such and such an age, or when I was around these type of people, or whatever it may be. So essentially, transforming impressions allows us to deconstruct the so-called story we have of ourselves and our lives, so that we can really break it down into what it is objectively. And again, that's up to us, not up to anyone else. We're really those who can do that. So we need to learn to transform impressions, because in doing so, we can transform our lives. Because we can find a lot of beliefs, opinions, prejudices tied into memories that we have, which are, in essence, a memory is impressions that we've associated together somehow. And the way that we do that is through comprehension. We meditate on it. We try to discover what it is that's behind it, so that we can extract the truth from those impressions. So we have to go back and go over the situation, do a retrospective exercise, and walk through the situation in our memory, visualizing it in the screen of the mind, and then analyze what's going on there, what really happened. An example: how do we transform the words of someone who flatters us? By comprehending. We are a little piece of dust on planet Earth, and the planet Earth is a little piece of dust in the cosmos. So if we're a piece of dust, cosmic dust, on another piece of cosmic dust, then really being proud doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And this is assisted by understanding our place in the universe. If we want to reach the absolute, if we want to connect with that unity, absolute unity, then we have to change our position. Our position now is we're on the earth. And so part of what this system teaches, this Gnostic system that we're studying, is how to do this, how to walk this ladder, how to go up this ladder and get closer to the absolute. But it requires that we disconnect ourselves to a certain extent from the earth, the attachments, we could say, to the earth. So if we're just some microorganisms belonging to a particle of dust on the earth, then why are we proud? Why do we think we're proud? It's easy to transform a flatterer then, when they say, oh, you're so good at this, or oh, thank you so much for blah, blah, blah. And just say, okay, well, that's their opinion of it. And they can be thankful. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But to say that we're good or we're the best or anything like that is really not understanding our place in the universe. And this leads us to understanding the need for a complete transformation of our impressions. And part of this is because the personality uses impressions in order to fortify the ego. We mentioned in the first series, the introductory series, that the personality ends up being the vehicle of the ego and not the essence. And in Gnosis, we make a distinction, a differentiation between ego and essence. And we say that ego is a fixed way of looking at the world or existence, and is generally not dynamic or dynamic enough. It is also called desire or psychic aggregates. It's a partial truth or not the whole truth. And if it's not the whole truth, then it's not the truth at all in the end. But we can find some information in there. We can extract some information from it. What we are is not ego. What we are is essence. We are a spark of divinity that's descended through the ray of creation and now is appearing in a physical organism, a so-called human organism on the planet Earth. The personality that we have has been used to interact with culture and the time period. But we're not the personality. We are essence. We have a personality, but that's not who we are. So this work is to develop essence. And it requires that we transform impressions. Normally what happens is that personality translates according to its conditioning. And as a result, it has incorrect associations and sends things to the wrong centers. For example, when we're insulted, it sends things to the emotional center so that we can get upset, instead of sending things to the intellectual center so we can analyze it, or to the superior emotional center so that we can forgive the person in that moment or understand them with our heart that they're hurting and they're taking it out on us, but it's not, they don't actually mean it towards us. Since the personality misuses impressions and sends it to the wrong centers within ourselves, then this produces incorrect results. Therefore, we have problems in life. The example given is that a woman is taking care of a man, and because she's giving him attention, he thinks that, or consideration and respect, as the example says, he thinks that she likes him. So he brings her flowers and chocolate and all these things. But if she never thought any of that or felt any of that, the only thing that she was doing was just trying to do a good job and be considerate and respectful, then she's surprised by all that. And actually, this is incorrect situation in terms of she doesn't have those feelings for him. And this all comes from untransformed impressions that we are not transforming, that we're allowing the ego to use, the personality and the ego to use. So we need to learn to transform impressions. First thing we need to do is learn how to relax the mind. We talked about meditation, excuse me, and we use meditation. We do meditations on Friday nights at the same time. But basically, learning how to quiet the mind so that the mind doesn't react, so that we can observe things and go through things without all these associations coming up, so that we can try and see things as they are, objectively. And it allows us to access knowledge of self. Because what we're talking about is that life is, in reality, our impressions of it. It's not something external. It's our impressions, which are internal. Life is something for us that's internal. And if we learn how to transform those impressions, that means we can transform our lives. The reason that this is difficult is because of the hypnotism of the senses. We have different types of mind we talked about. Sensual mind, the mind related with the senses. Intermediate mind, which is just beliefs, dogmas, opinions, concepts which are based on the sensual mind. And then we have interior mind, which is what we want to access, what we want to open up inside of ourselves. Because it works with the data from the consciousness, which is beyond thinking. Consciousness is beyond thinking, according to the system we're studying. And this interior mind is something similar to a Zen mind or quiet mind. A mind that's like a lake, a mountain lake, that's calm and still, and therefore it's able to reflect the sky above. The sky above, in this case, is our inner divinity, speaking to us through the consciousness. And so all of this requires that we need to think psychologically, not in the normal way that modern cultures think about things. And we need to work against those egos, those desires that we carry within. Because we need to work at the point where impressions enter into us, which is when we receive impressions. When we hear somebody say something, when we see somebody do something, we need to transform the impressions then. The second part that we talked about is that impressions themselves are actually a type of energy, which is called hydrogen 48 in esoteric chemistry. We breathe in air, we eat food, but we also receive impressions. And the impressions that we receive enter us and become images. And for anybody who says this isn't true, then why is it that when we listen to certain songs, certain music, it gives us a certain type of energy? Some people have a playlist for their exercise routine. Some people have music that they like to listen to when they drive, or when they get off of work, or when they wake up in the morning. Impressions are a type of energy. If you listen to some old speeches in the 60s and 70s, the people that were involved in the counterculture, involved in sort of the attempt at correcting American society as an example, but in all cultures they have it, an attempt at redirecting society, you could say. You can get a lot of energy from them because they're there really analyzing. If they're a good speech maker, writer, or giver, I'm thinking of Malcolm X. He's excellent if you listen to the way that he talks. Maybe we don't agree with everything that he says, but the way that he talks, he has a very interesting impression when we receive his impressions. Because he's thought about it. He's reflected on it. So, I'm not saying he's Gnostic. What I'm saying is the impressions you receive when you listen to him can give you a type of energy. Same with listening to music. Same with listening to JFK doing a speech, or a lot of people during that time period. In any case, if we don't transform or digest those impressions, that energy, that hydrogen 48, then it becomes fuel for the ego. It becomes food that the ego, the desires, use, and they become stronger. Which means our life is going to be more weighted towards suffering, towards those desires, and we know Buddhism teaches us desire causes suffering. So, we want to understand that we have a choice. Either we transform the impressions and we extract the energy from them, or we don't, and the ego extracts the energy from them. And if we allow the ego to do that, then the personality becomes stronger, our desires increase, our attachments are going to increase, and our life is going to be more problematic, more centered around suffering. So we need to understand the necessity for transforming impressions. And this will allow us to become a different person who's not rooted in the personality, but that's rooted in essence. We need to cease being what we are in order to become what we're not. If we're satisfied with what we are, then we don't need gnosis. But if we want to become something different, if we're not satisfied with who and what we are, and we want to become something else, if we want it to change, then we need to stop being who we are, to start being who we're not. This is an esoteric thing, right? Not something that the general population is interested in. One has to become lost to oneself. The result of all this is the appearance of someone who is not oneself, because we're not attached to the personality. We're different from however many years ago when we started working on ourselves. We're not interested in the same things. We're not attracted to the same things anymore. And that may change in the future. And that's okay, because it's part of the process of getting closer to our inner divinity and giving up our attachments, our desires. But in order to do this, we have to be sincere with ourselves. So part of it, as we mentioned, is to starve the ego so that our desires don't get stronger. And the other part is to extract that energy, because we can actually use that energy for the superior aspects of our organism, which are related with what are called the solar bodies or superior existential bodies. And then the last thing we gave was a method from chapter 1, section 45, System to Transform the Impressions of the Day. A method to transform impressions. First, we need to relax. We need to be able to relax. Next, reach the state of meditation. Once we're in the meditation, and again, if you want to see the Gnostic methods on this, we do it on Friday nights at the same time. We do the meditation, and you can, once you listen to one or two of them, you'll be able to understand the whole process. It's very similar each time. Once you've reached a state of meditation, then you can relive the scene just as it occurred, which is called the retrospective exercise. So we review the memory, the impression that occurred, and then we look for the I or ego that caused the problem within ourselves. Was it my pride? Was it my anger? Was it my lust? Was it my greed? Was it my gluttony? What is it that's causing a problem? We have to find it in ourselves. And then, observing serenely, we then take that ego that we just found, imagining it on a defendant's chair in a courtroom where the Divine Mother is the judge. And we ask her, well, we present our case of why we want this ego eliminated, why we want this impression transformed. And we ask for her judgment on it. And we ask for her to eliminate, to disintegrate the I problem or ego problem that we've just observed, found and observed within ourselves. So this is a system for transforming impressions and for eliminating egos. But we have to find it in ourselves, because that's the only thing we can really work on is our internal world. Sure, we can do things in the external world, but the internal world is the one we really need to learn to control. Because if we can control that, then we can handle just about anything in the external world. So all of this brings us back to self-observation, the study of oneself, the primary method of self-study. From what we've studied, self-observation has two basic fields: the observation of the human machine, which is the three brains or five centers, and the observation of the personality and its mechanical reactions. In the previous series, the introductory series, we discussed the difference between the intellect, emotional, and moving functions. And now we must, as we observe ourselves, immediately refer our impressions to this or that category. What it means is we need to categorize the impressions. So when we say self-observation, we're already directing our attention towards our interior, towards our self. At first, we must take a mental note of only those observations which we are certain. That is, those that we have no doubt about at all. Those where we see at once to what category they belong. So, is it an intellectual thing? This talks about the three brains. Is this intellectual? Is it a thought? Is it a sensation? Is it a feeling? Is it an emotion? That's where we need to categorize it. We have to reject all vague or doubtful cases and remember only those which are unquestionable. So we're trying to gather accurate data. If we don't know if what I just observed inside of myself was a thought or a feeling or a sensation, then I need to throw it away in terms of, or I should say put it to the side in terms of its category. If the work is carried on properly, the number of unquestionable observations will rapidly increase. And that which seemed doubtful before will be clearly seen to belong to the first, the second, or the third center. Each center has its own memory, its own associations, and its own processing. That's why we study each of the three brains separately. Self-observation will very quickly show us that our mental life is much richer than we think, or in any case, that it contains more possibilities than we think. Without properly applied self-observation, a person will never understand the connection between the various functions of their machine. What machine are we talking about? What machine are we talking about? We're talking about the human machine, our organism. Without properly applied self-observation, a person will never understand the connection between the various functions of their machine. As part of what we're studying is how we work, how our internal world works. That's why we need to observe ourselves. And if we are having trouble with understanding these connections, because we're not self-observing, then we'll never understand how and why, on each separate occasion, everything in us happens. We talked about this before. Everything happens. The same way that when clouds gather and accumulate, there's a certain amount of moisture, there's rain, or when the wind blows and there's dust and it moves the dust. We should understand this idea of everything happens. To learn the methods of self-observation and of right self-study requires a certain understanding of the functions and the characteristics of the human machine. Thus, in observing the functions of the human machine, it is necessary to understand the correct divisions of the functions observed and to be able to define them exactly and at once. And the definition must not be a verbal, but an inner definition, by taste or flavor, by sensation, in the same way as we define all inner experiences. So there are two important methods for self-study. Registering or recording, which is simply recording in one's mind what is observed at a given moment. And analysis, or attempts at analysis. That is, attempts to find the answers to questions upon what does a certain thing depend and why does it happen. So, registering or recording and analysis. Those are the two important methods of self-study. Self-observation, especially in the beginning, must not become analysis or attempts at analysis. Analysis will only become possible much later, when a person knows all the functions of their machine and all the laws which govern it. In trying to analyze some phenomenon that we come across within ourselves, we generally ask, what is this? Why does it happen in this way and not in some other way? As we begin to seek an answer to these questions, we forget all about observing and we completely lose the thread of self-observation. We forget about it entirely. And then observation stops. So it's clear from this that only one thing can go on, either observation or attempts at analysis. Before it is possible to analyze even the most elementary phenomenon, a person must accumulate sufficient quantity of material by means of recording. What they're saying is, before you can analyze the data, you have to gather the data. And in order for you to gather the data, you have to observe yourself. That is your way of gathering data. Recording is the result of a direct observation of what is taking place at a given moment, and it is the most important material in the work of self-study. When a certain number of records have been accumulated, and when at the same time laws to a certain extent have been studied and understood, then analysis becomes possible. From the very beginning, observation or recording must be based upon the understanding of the fundamental principles of the activity of the human machine. Self-observation cannot be properly applied without knowing these principles, without constantly bearing them in mind. Observation must begin with the division of functions. The division of functions means, is it a thought? Is it emotion? Is it a movement? Is it an instinct? Is it sexual? All the activity of the human machine is divided into 5 sharply defined groups, each of which is controlled by its own special brain or center. In observing themselves, a person must differentiate between the 5 basic functions of their machine: the thinking, the emotional, the moving, the instinctive, and the sexual. Every phenomenon that a person observes in themselves is related to one or the other of these functions. Therefore, before beginning to observe, a person must understand how the functions differ, what intellectual activity means, what emotional activity means, what moving activity means, what instinctive activity means, and what sexual activity means. We're talking about interior observation. And this was defined in the introductory series. I want to say it's part 5. But it could be part 3. Might be related with the 3 brains, part 3. But in any case, we defined it, and there's good information in there, which you can find if you go to introductory. Let's see it here. Self-observation, it's class 3. Self-observation, self-study, and the 3 brains. And here it says what each thing is. The difference between the thinking functions and feeling or emotions, moving. So it's got all of this defined here so that you can review it. Observation must begin from 0. All previous experience, the results of all previous self-observation must be laid aside. They may contain much valuable data, much valuable material, but all this material is based upon wrong division of functions. It cannot therefore be utilized, at least not at the beginning of this work of self-study. The human being must begin observing themselves as though they do not know themselves at all, as though they have never observed themselves before. When a person begins to observe themselves, they must try to determine at once to what group, to which center or centers belong the phenomenon that is being observed at the moment. Some people find it difficult to understand the difference between thought and feeling. Others have difficulty understanding the difference between feeling and sensation, between a thought and a moving impulse. Speaking on very broad lines, one may say that the thinking function always works by means of comparison. Intellectual conclusions are always the result of the comparison of 2 or more impressions. Sensation and emotion do not reason. They do not compare. They simply define a given impression by its aspect, by its being pleasant or unpleasant in one sense or another, by its color, taste, or smell. Moreover, sensations can be indifferent, neither warm nor cold, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. White paper, red pencil. Those are the examples. Those are indifferent sensations. Or they can be, unless we have some association with a white paper and a red pencil, which would be related to transforming impressions. In the sensation of white or red, there is nothing either pleasant or unpleasant. At least, there does not need to be anything pleasant or unpleasant connected with this or that color. These sensations, the so-called 5 senses and others, like the feeling of warmth, cold, and so on, those are instinctive. So when we have a sensation, not a feeling, not an emotion, a sensation, then it gets associated with the instinctive center when we're observing ourselves. Feeling functions or emotions are always pleasant or unpleasant. Indifferent emotions do not exist. The difficulty of distinguishing between the functions is increased by the fact that people differ very much in the way they feel or sense their functions. This is what we do not generally understand. We assume people to be much more alike than they really are. In reality, however, there exists between them great differences in the forms and methods of their perception. Some perceive chiefly through their intellect, others through their feeling, and others through sensation. Right? We talked about this before. These are related to the first three different types of human beings. Human being number 1, human being number 2, human being number 3. It is very difficult, almost impossible, for people of different categories and of different modes of perception to understand one another, because they call one and the same thing by different names, and they call different things by the same name. Besides this, various other combinations are possible as well. Right? So people say, like, well, I don't feel like this is a good idea. But do they mean feeling? Do they mean emotions? Do they mean sensations? Do they mean they don't think it's a good idea? Is it thoughts? One person perceives by thoughts and sensations, another by thoughts and feelings, and so on. One or another mode of perception is immediately connected with one or another kind of reaction to external events. Our mode of perception is connected with our reaction to external events. That is the way that we react to those impressions that we receive from the external events. The result of this difference in perception and reaction to external events is expressed in the first place by the fact that, 1, people do not understand one another, and in the second fact, by 2, that they do not understand themselves. Very often a person calls their thoughts or their reasoning their feelings. They call their feelings their thoughts, and their sensations their feelings, which is the most common. If two people perceive the same thing differently, let us say that one perceives it through the feelings and another through sensation, then they may argue all their lives and never understand in what consists the difference of their attitude towards a given object. Actually, one is seeing it from one aspect and another in another aspect. In order to find a way of discriminating, we must understand that every normal psychic function is a means or an instrument of knowledge. With the help of the intellect, we see one aspect of things and events, and with the help of emotions, we see another aspect. With the help of sensations, a third aspect. The most complete knowledge of a given subject possible for us can only be obtained if we examine it simultaneously with our intellect, feelings, and sensations. Every person who is striving after knowledge must aim at the possibility of attaining such perception. In ordinary conditions, a person sees the world through a crooked, uneven window, and even if they realize this, they have a very difficult time changing it. This or that mode of perception depends upon the work of their organism as a whole. All functions are interconnected and counterbalance one another. All functions strive to keep one another in the state in which they are. Therefore, when a person begins to study themselves, they must understand that if they discover something in themselves that they dislike, they may not be able to change it right away. To study is one thing, and to change is another. But study is the first step towards the possibility of change in the future. As we watch the work of the centers, we will observe side by side with their right working, their wrong working. Right? So what we're observing when we observe internally is their centers. Which center? Intellect, emotional, movement, sensation, instinct or sensation, and sex. So we'll see them working properly, the centers working correctly, and them working incorrectly. As we watch the work of the centers, we will observe side by side with their right working, their wrong working. That is, the working of one center for another, the attempts of the thinking center to feel or to pretend that it feels. The attempts of the thinking center to pretend that it feels. The attempts of the emotional center to think. The attempts of the moving center to think and feel, etc. The wrong working of a center often occurs when it does not use its own energy. Each center has its own particular type of energy that it normally works with, but when it runs out of energy, the machine must either switch to another center or steal energy from another center. So this is moving into what we will discover when we're observing ourselves and observing our centers. For us to switch to another center, a center which is not exhausted, would be ideal. But sometimes we cannot, and other times we don't want to. Either way, energy is stolen from another center to continue the work in the present center. Typically, when the machine steals energy, it does so from the sexual center. So, let's say I need to study for a test, and I need to use my intellectual center, and I'm studying. At some point, my intellectual center is going to run out of energy. I will have consumed all the energy, especially with the volume of assignments that they're giving people nowadays. But if I switch to another center, listen to some music, go for a walk, go exercise, that will allow my intellectual center to start recouping some energy, creating some more energy, or it's not exactly creating, but acquiring more energy, because I'm giving it a break, switching to another center. But if I don't do that, then eventually what happens is the intellectual center will steal the sexual center's energy. Because it doesn't have any other energy, it has to get it from somewhere. As a result, all the centers rob the sexual center of its energy and produce with this energy quite wrong work full of useless excitement, and in return give the sexual center useless energy with which it is unable to work. So this gets into the type of energy that each of the centers have, and the energy of the sexual center is a more volatile, a more fiery, a more explosive or powerful energy. And so the intellect doesn't have that energy. As an example, in order to understand the type of energy that the sexual center has, we can tell within less than a second whether or not we're attracted to someone. We don't need to think about it. It's immediate. If you see someone, you can tell immediately if you're sexually attracted to them. So the energy is very quick. The center itself is very quick. So what happens is that energy ends up getting stolen. Now the intellect tries to use that energy. It doesn't work the same way because the machinery, the mechanism, the machine of the intellect can't handle that volatility. So we get giddy and excited and have difficulty paying attention or focusing or whatever it may be. Now, some people get used to it and they can do it, or maybe they take tea or caffeine or whatever and they're able to do it. But eventually what happens is the sexual center doesn't work because we've stolen all the energy from there. Now, if you go to sleep or you rest or you switch, energy comes back. Unless we're starting to eat into that energy that we have in reserve. Now, The reason that this is possible is because, let's say, and you may have heard stories about this, someone gets into a car accident and there's a person under the car, right? The car rolls and there's somebody under. You could lift up a car. There's stories of a human being lifting up a car to pull out a person underneath. Another person will pull them out, or they'll pull them out. And this is possible because of the sexual center's energy that the motor center is able to use to do that. And so there's a purpose for that, right? To help another person to survive in moments of danger. So it could be for positive or for negative, depends on how we use it. But the point is that this is called wrong working of the centers, when the sexual center's energy is stolen and used by another center, any one of the other centers. One center working for another is useful in certain cases, since it preserves the continuity of mental activity. But if this becomes habitual, then it also becomes harmful, since it begins to interfere with right working by enabling each center to avoid its own direct duties and to do whatever it likes best at the moment instead of what it ought to be doing. In a normal, healthy person, each center does its own work, that is, the work for which it was specially designed and which it can best perform. There are situations in life which the thinking center alone can deal with and can find a way out of. If at this moment the emotional center begins to take on the work and work instead, then it will make a mess of everything, and the result of its interference will be very unbalanced. In an unbalanced kind of person, the substitution of one center for another goes on almost continually. And this is precisely what being unbalanced or neurotic means. In an unbalanced person, each center strives to pass its work to another center, and at the same time, it strives to do the work of another center for which it is not suited. It gives its work to somebody else and takes on work that it's not good at doing. The emotional center working for the thinking center brings unnecessary nervousness, feverishness, and hurry into situations where, on the contrary, calm judgment and deliberation are essential. The thinking center working for the emotional center brings deliberation into situations which require quick decisions and makes a person incapable of distinguishing the peculiarities and the finer points of the position. Thought is too slow. It works out a certain plan of action and continues to follow it, even though the circumstances have changed and quite a different course of action is now necessary. Besides, in some cases, the interference of the thinking center gives rise to entirely wrong reactions, because the thinking center is simply incapable of understanding the shades and distinctions of many events. Events that are quite different for the moving and emotional centers appear to be alike to the thinking center. Its decisions are much too general and do not correspond to the decisions which the emotional center would have made. This becomes perfectly clear if we imagine the interference of thought in the domain of feeling or sensation or of movement. In all three cases, the interference of the thinking leads to wholly undesirable results. Intellect cannot understand shades of feeling. We shall see this clearly if we imagine one person reasoning about the emotions of another. They're not feeling anything themselves, so the feelings of the other person do not exist for them. But for the other person, those emotions have a definite existence. Another way to say this is, a full man does not understand a hungry man. And the decisions of the intellect can never satisfy a person who is using their emotions or instinctual center. In exactly the same way, the intellect cannot appreciate sensations, for the intellect sensations are dead. Nor is the intellect capable of controlling movement. Instances of this kind are the easiest to find. Whatever work a person may be doing, it is enough for them to try to do each action deliberately, with their thought, following every movement, and they will see that the quality of their work will change immediately. If they're typing, their fingers, controlled by their moving center, find the necessary letters themselves. But if they try to ask themselves before every letter, where is the K? Where is the comma? How is this word spelled? Then suddenly they begin to make mistakes or write very slowly. If one drives a car with the help of one's thoughts, one can only go in the lowest gear. Thinking cannot keep pace with all the movements necessary for developing a greater speed. To drive at full speed, especially in the streets of a large town, while steering with the help of one's intellect, is very difficult for an ordinary person. The motor center working for the thinking center produces mechanical reading or mechanical listening. Like when a person reads or listens to nothing but the words, but is utterly unconscious of what they are reading or hearing. This generally happens when attention of the thinking center is occupied with something else, and when the moving center is trying to replace the absent attention of the thinking center. But this very easily becomes a habit, because the thinking center is generally distracted not by useful work, that is, by thinking or by contemplation, but simply by daydreaming or by fantasy, imagination used by an ego. Fantasy is one of the principal sources of the wrong work of the centers. Each center has its own form of fantasy or daydreaming, but as a rule, both the moving and the emotional centers make use of the thinking center, which very readily places itself at their disposal for this purpose, because daydreaming corresponds to the thinking center's own inclinations. That means the thinking center, the intellectual center, is inclined to daydream. Daydreaming is absolutely the opposite of useful mental activity. Useful in this case means activity directed towards a definite aim and undertaken for the sake of obtaining a definite result. Daydreaming does not pursue any beneficial aim or result. The motive for daydreaming almost always lies in the emotional or in the motor instinctive sexual brains, but the actual process is carried out by the thinking center. The inclination to daydream is partly due to the laziness of the thinking center, that is, its attempts to avoid the efforts connected with the work directed towards a definite aim and going in a definite direction, and partly due to the tendency of the emotional and moving centers to repeat to themselves, to keep alive or to recreate both pleasant and unpleasant experiences that have been previously lived through or imagined. That's a lot of information right there, and now you see why we had to cover impressions beforehand, before we studied this information. Because he's saying, this is Gurdjieff through Ouspensky, that the emotional and moving centers have a tendency to repeat to themselves, to keep alive or to recreate both pleasant and unpleasant experiences that they have previously lived through or that they have imagined. That's the type of daydreaming that the emotional and moving centers want to have. Very interesting now when we think about observing our daydreaming. Daydreaming of disagreeable things is very characteristic of the unbalanced state of the human machine. After all, one can understand daydreaming of a pleasant kind and even find justification for it. But daydreaming of an unpleasant character is certainly useless. And yet many people spend 9/10 of their lives in just such painful daydreams about misfortunes which may overtake them or their family, about illnesses that they may contract or suffer, or sufferings that they will have to endure, etc. Fantasy and daydreaming are definite examples of the wrong work of the thinking center. The question of the erroneous functioning of the centers is a topic that demands a lifetime of study by way of the observation of oneself in action and of the rigorous examination of dreams. So if we want to understand the wrong working of the centers, we're not just going to study our 5 brains, our 5 centers or 3 brains. We will also include the examination of dreams. It is not possible to achieve the comprehension of the centers and their correct or incorrect function in an instant. We need infinite patience. All of life unfolds as a function of the centers and is controlled by them. Our thoughts, ideas, feelings, hopes, fears, love, hatred, deeds, sensations, pleasures, satisfactions, frustrations, etc. are found in our centers, in our 3 brains. The discovery of some inhuman element in any of the centers must be the strongest motive for the esoteric work. He's talking about an ego. Any psychological defect must be previously comprehended by means of the technique of meditation before proceeding to its elimination. So we mentioned the different types of human beings, right? We said the human being number 1 is the instinctive human being. Human being number 2 is emotional. Human being number 3 is intellectual, related with the 3 brains. But there's a 4th type of human being, the balanced human being. And that's when we start studying the esoteric work and we want to become different, then that's the goal, the sort of first step we want to move into, to become human being number 4, to become the balanced human being, which means that our centers are balanced, which means they're not having the wrong working. Which means we're not daydreaming, there's not energy being stolen, each center is doing the correct work. In the 4th level or 4th type of human being, we find the perfect development and harmonic equilibrium of all the centers. In the 4th level, we find perfect harmony and rhythmical concordance in the functions of the 5 centers of the human machine. In order to arrive at the 4th level, we have to totally develop the 5 centers. No one could develop the 5 centers of the human machine if they reject all the activities that exist in the world. All the things of the world are useful for the development of every part of the centers. We must know that every center of the machine possesses different parts. The sexual center works harmoniously and reaches its harmonious development through the transmutation of the creative energies. The instinctive center does not need any educative rule. It can educate itself because it is the one that keeps us alive. It is the one that regulates all the activities of the organism and directs them wisely. If we would want to teach the instinctive center, we can risk losing our life or catching any disease. We should remember that we could not have the heart, liver, or kidneys functioning if we did not possess in our nature the instinctive center. Or even breathing, we could say. The motor center, or center of movement, is educated by harmonious habits. Reviewing carefully all our habits of conduct, eliminating certain habits, eliminating those that are not convenient to us, selecting and learning new habits that are good for us, practicing certain exercises or simply sports like long walks, taking in the fresh air, etc. It also unfolds with the activities related to manual labor like mechanics, driving cars, bicycles, or horse riding, swimming, etc. The emotional center can develop in its superlative form through the cultivation of the arts. We can listen to Beethoven, Mozart, or Liszt to learn aesthetic beauty or learn how to paint, etc. Anything related with art. The intellectual center can be developed with the study of botany, astrology, medicine, or just with the study of esotericism, etc. So that's the end of our material for today. You see now it's called self-observation, recording the right and wrong working of the centers. We have to observe ourselves to gather that data about ourselves. It can't come from any other place. And when we do that, we have to understand what it is that we're observing. We have to know to what category we can associate what we've observed in ourselves, related with the three brains and the five centers. And then, when we start observing those centers, we find that they have correct functioning and incorrect functioning. And so now we can see that if we want to be balanced, if we want to be human being number 4, then we need to have correct working of the centers. We have to eliminate the wrong working of the centers. So that's a study in and of itself. So all of this is for us to understand psychology in its intermediate aspect, because now the next 5 classes, 6 through 10, we're going to study the intellect and the mind, the emotions, habits and actions, and then a sexual center, and we'll go back over the wrong working of the centers at the very end. So we will have class next week. We'll start on the intellectual center, and then we'll be off for 2 weeks. We'll come back in January, and we'll be back at it to do another to pick back up the series. But we'll take off for Christmas and New Year's. So we want to thank you guys for your attention. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to submit them at this time. Thank you, like I said, for your attention. Thanks for being here, and appreciate your interest in this. That's why we're giving the classes. Well, all right. Looking forward to seeing you guys next week, and or talking to you next week, I guess I should say technically. And in the meantime, we invite you to join us for the meditation tomorrow. And otherwise, if you aren't there, then hopefully we can talk to you next week. All right, have a good one.